Yeah, so I think everybody's really kind of excited and nervous at the same time that if this doesn't get beyond, I call it the echo chamber,
Yeah.
we won't be much further forward, and we've got to get on board with it, and we've got to run with it, and yeah, it's sort of slightly make or break, I feel.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think the kind of the sort of center point of this is the national education nature park. I think I've got that the right way around, and the climate leaders award, and that's what they're tendering for at the moment, and that as well, quite ambitiously, is set to sort of be launched in autumn 2022, which is probably the only thing which looks very, very urgent in this. The other time horizons are quite long, like the introduction of the natural history GCSE is not until hopefully 2025, and that will only be probably available to a handful of schools, you'd imagine, to begin with. So that's quite urgent. And then I was just looking at like the vision and the aims of it, and I think what struck me when I was reading through it is that there's kind of four aims. There's excellence in education and skills for a changing world, and then there's net zero, which is making all the buildings net zero. It doesn't say by when, but they kind of have a vision that the UK will be world leading education sector in sustainability climate by 2030. So maybe it's net zero by 2030, which would be awesome if that actually came about. Although real zero, obviously better. And then they talk about resilience to climate change, which is good to see kind of adaptation being in there, especially when you think about the education estate and how many buildings aren't sort of fit for purpose, especially for heat waves, which we're going to get more and more of. And I mean, I'm sure you've been in classrooms where it's just baking and everybody's falling asleep.
At the best of times, yeah, I did. It does mention, it's just slipped in there about ready for potentially 4 degrees. Did you see that in the document? It's just sort of like, oh gosh, okay.
Yeah,
That's a real recognition of how things, could be.
Yeah, that language slips through occasionally. I think it's driven kind of by DEFRA Environment Agency sort of saying, well, we need to prepare for 4 degrees of warming, which is extraordinary.
It's really interesting because I used to work at DEFRA and left in, I think it was 2016. And still then, it was quite a struggle to get other government departments to take this seriously. And often DEFRA was sort of a bit on the periphery or hadn't been invited, and going on and on about this, trying to get Cabinet Office on board. So from that point of view, the fact that this is coming from DFE, there's a huge team working on it, and that sort of language is in there. I feel at the same time like half glass full and half glass empty. like with all this stuff, COP26 as well, and I keep sort of veering between the two. But yeah, in an ideal world, what would you have wanted to see in this?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of point I was making there, is that there's these 4 aims, and 3 of them, I mean, the fourth one is a better environment for future generations, which is enhancing biodiversity and speaks to the kind of nature part of it. And so 3 of the 4 aims are really just infrastructural and operational aims. And then there's the one education aim. And then when it gets into, and they call it an action area. So when you get into that action area on climate education, A is quite narrow because it's talking about climate education, and we'd like that to be broader. And I think it's quite telling within it that the subheading it talks about education about the environmental issues, and then it talks about support for teachers for it and bringing through more resources, which is obviously something the GAP tries to do. And then it talks about education in, but it doesn't really talk about education for. What that might look like. And this is kind of, and it's sort of quite indicative, I think, of the mindset going on here, that it's sort of, if we provide the facts and the information and the knowledge, then young people, I think actually somewhere it says that young people will be more likely to take action. I think they say, will empower young people to be global citizens if they better understand climate change and have a greater connection to nature. And that's kind of a statement of fact they're making there, but we know that it's far more than that. Like there's those 2 things are drivers and motivators, but there's all sorts of other motivators connected to sort of your values and the skills that you have and your broader feeling about issues like climate justice and so on can all drive into this. But that doesn't seem to be there. So there's quite a few statements in it which aren't massively backed up, and I'd love to see more of that stuff backed up. And I think that'll come through, I think, through the tenders, that people will say, like, this is going to be, this is what really empowers young people, and this is what we need to include in something like a Climate Leaders Award and the National Nature Park.